come here for a moment. You don't have to nod. You don't have to agree. You don't even have to feel hopeful right now. Just stay with me. Just let me speak for a breath or two. I'm not here to convince you that happiness is waiting somewhere. I'm not here to tell you that everything will be fine. I know better than that. You know better than that. You don't distrust happiness because you're bitter. You don't hold back because you're closed. You don't step carefully because something is wrong with you. You learned this. You learned it the honest way. The way people learn when joy arrives, unannounced, lights up the room, and then quietly leaves without explaining itself. You learn that happiness doesn't always warn you before it goes. And after a few goodbyes like that, the heart does something very intelligent. It stops unpacking too quickly. It keeps one hand on the door. So if you find yourself smiling, but not leaning all the way into it, if you notice yourself enjoying a moment, yet already bracing for the end, if part of you whispers, "Don't get used to this," even when things feel warm, that isn't fear, that is memory. People rarely talk about this part of life, especially not to women like you. They assume strength means you should be over it by now. They assume maturity means you should want less. They assume time heals everything if you just keep moving. But time doesn't erase what was real. It just teaches us how to carry it more quietly. I've noticed something about women who have lived a while. They don't stop wanting happiness. They stop trusting its timing. They stop believing it will stay long enough for them to rest inside it. So they become careful with joy. They learn to enjoy without surrendering. They learn to laugh while keeping their balance. They learn to love the moment, but not lean on it. And from the outside, people mistake that for distance. They call it guarded. They call it reserved. They call it hard to please. But I don't see that. I see someone who once opened her arms fully and paid attention to what happened next. I see someone who didn't shut down, but adjusted. I see someone who learned how to survive happiness leaving. That kind of learning leaves a mark. Not a scar, a mark. It changes how you enter rooms, how long you linger in good moments, how you measure promises, even the gentle ones. You might not say it out loud, but I can hear it anyway. You don't trust happiness because it never stayed. Not long enough. Not when you needed it most. So now, when joy shows up, you greet it politely. You don't invite it to move in. You don't ask it to stay the night. You sit across from it, have a quiet conversation, and keep your coat nearby. That isn't coldness. That is wisdom shaped by loss. I won't tell you to undo that. I won't tell you to open up like it's a switch you forgot to flip. I won't ask you to believe again, or risk again, or try harder. That language doesn't fit a life like yours. What I will say is this. There's nothing wrong with you for moving slowly toward happiness. There's nothing broken in the way you hesitate. There's nothing weak about the way you protect the parts of you that have already paid their price. You didn't stop believing in joy. You stopped gambling with it. You learned how to be present without expecting permanence. You learned how to feel without assuming safety. You learned how to stand steady even when something beautiful might leave. That kind of learning comes from love, not from failure. And if you're wondering why it feels so tiring sometimes, why even good moments can leave you strangely quiet afterward, it's because holding joy at arm's length still takes effort. It takes awareness. It takes control. It's not that you don't want happiness. It's that you don't want to fall through the floor when it disappears again. So you keep your feet planted. You enjoy what's here, but you don't hand it the keys. I see that. I respect that. I'm not here to pull you out of that space. I'm just sitting close enough so you don't have to defend it. You don't owe happiness your trust. Not yet. Not ever, if you don't want to. But you do deserve to understand yourself without judgment. To see that your caution is not a flaw, but a response. A response to having loved deeply and lost honestly. And maybe, just maybe, there's another way for joy to exist with you now. Not as something that promises forever, but as something that can sit quietly beside you without asking you to forget what you've learned. I'm not asking you to lean in. I'm not asking you to believe. I'm simply here, acknowledging the truth of why you learned to stand where you are, and staying with that truth long enough for it to feel safe to breathe. I want to stay close to something you may not have said out loud, but you've lived with for a long time. You didn't stop believing in happiness. You stopped risking yourself inside it. There's a difference, and it matters more than people realize. If you truly stopped believing, you would feel empty, numb, detached from the idea altogether. But that's not you. You still notice beauty. You still feel warmth when a moment is gentle. You still recognize happiness when it passes by. You just don't step into it the way you once did. That change didn't come from cynicism. It came from experience. At some point, believing started to cost more than it gave back. Not all at once. Slowly. Quietly. You believed in a life that felt settled once. You believed in a person who stood close until they didn't. You believed in a future that looked solid until it shifted without warning. None of that made you naive. It made you human. But the body remembers these things before the mind explains them. So instead of losing faith, you adjusted the risk. You learned how to feel without falling forward. How to enjoy without expecting protection. How to keep your center even when something beautiful might disappear. From the outside, it can look like you've grown distant from happiness. But from where I'm sitting, it looks like you grew precise. You didn't close your heart. You narrowed the opening. And there's wisdom in that. People don't often talk about how many goodbyes happen without drama. How many endings don't arrive as explosions, but as quiet absences. A chair no longer pulled out at the table. A voice that used to check in, now silent. A future that slowly stops asking you to imagine it. Those moments teach restraint. So when happiness shows up now, you don't rush it. You don't announce it. You don't lean your full weight into it. You let it exist. But you keep your footing. That doesn't mean you doubt it. It means you respect how fragile it once proved to be. I know women like you are often told they've become careful, as if care were a flaw, as if discernment were the same as fear. But I see something else. I see someone who learned that not every good feeling comes with a safety net. Someone who learned that hope can be real and still temporary. Someone who realized that believing too quickly can cost more than it gives. So, you stopped risking the part of you that takes the hardest fall. That doesn't mean you don't want happiness. It means you don't want to bleed for it anymore. And that's an important distinction, because belief lives quietly in you still. It shows up in small ways, in how you soften when something feels genuine, in how you linger just a second longer in a peaceful moment, in how your eyes still recognize sincerity when it appears. You didn't lose that. You just stopped handing it your balance. There's a particular tiredness that comes with this stage of life. Not physical exhaustion, emotional weariness, the kind that comes from having rebuilt yourself more than once, from having trusted, adapted, recovered, and kept going, from learning that resilience doesn't mean invulnerability, it means survival. So, now, when people suggest you open up or let yourself believe again, it can feel strangely dismissive, as if they're asking you to forget what it cost to learn caution, as if wisdom were something to undo. I won't ask that of you. I won't ask you to risk the part of you that had to learn the hard way. What I will do is sit with the truth of who you became. You became someone who can feel joy without clinging to it. Someone who can appreciate love without assuming permanence. Someone who knows how to stand steady even when happiness doesn't promise to stay. That's not failure. That's evolution. And maybe the quiet tension you feel, sometimes the distance between joy and trust, isn't something to fix. Maybe it's simply the space where your past and your present are still learning how to speak to each other. You're not withholding happiness. You're protecting yourself from the shock of losing it again. That doesn't make you guarded. It makes you attentive. I want you to hear this clearly, without pressure or expectation. You don't owe happiness your risk. Not after everything you've already navigated. You're allowed to enjoy without surrendering. You're allowed to smile without promising yourself anything. You're allowed to let good moments exist without asking them to stay. Belief doesn't always look like leaping forward. Sometimes it looks like standing still and saying, I see you, but I'm keeping my balance. I'm not here to change that stance. I'm here to recognize it. To acknowledge that the woman who learned how to stop risking herself didn't disappear from joy. She simply learned how to survive it. And I'm staying right here with that understanding, without asking you to move, without asking you to prove anything, letting this truth settle naturally, so whatever comes next can arrive without being forced. Let me offer you a gentler way to look at something that may have felt like a loss for a long time. Happiness doesn't disappear. It changes how it stays. I'm not saying this to correct you. I'm not saying it to persuade you. I'm saying it because, when I look at you closely, I don't see someone who lost happiness. I see someone who outgrew the version of it that couldn't survive real life. There was a time when happiness felt obvious. It arrived loudly. It filled rooms. It announced itself with plans, promises, and certainty. It made you feel chosen, safe, certain that tomorrow would look like today. And when that version of happiness left, it didn't just go quietly. It took its confidence with it. It left behind a question you never asked to carry. Was it ever real if it didn't last? So now, when people talk about happiness, they often mean the old kind. The kind that sparkles, the kind that demands belief, the kind that asks you to leap without checking the ground. But your life has taught you something different. The happiness that fits you now doesn't arrive with fireworks. It doesn't ask for declarations. It doesn't promise permanence. It comes softly, almost carefully, as if it understands who you've become. You may not have noticed it at first, because it no longer insists on being the center of your world. It doesn't need your full attention. It doesn't ask you to rearrange your life around it. It stays in smaller ways, quieter ways, ways that don't require you to abandon yourself. Happiness now might look like peace that doesn't explain itself, a moment of ease that doesn't ask for a future, a connection that feels sincere without needing guarantees. It might show up as a calm evening rather than an exciting plan, a sense of being understood instead of being pursued, a quiet belonging rather than a dramatic attachment. That doesn't make it weaker. It makes it honest. I think part of the reason happiness feels unfamiliar now is because it stopped asking you to perform for it. It stopped needing you to be optimistic. It stopped rewarding you for hope. It simply sits where you are. And that can feel unsettling if you were taught that happiness must be earned, chased, or secured. If you were taught that joy must prove itself by staying. But what if happiness was never meant to stay the same way forever? What if it was always meant to evolve as you did? You didn't lose happiness when you learned to be careful. You refined your relationship with it. You stopped asking it to save you. You stopped asking it to define your worth. You stopped asking it to protect you from disappointment. And in doing that, you made space for a version of happiness that doesn't collapse under pressure. This version doesn't demand your trust. It doesn't punish you for caution. It doesn't disappear when you don't chase it. It stays differently. It stays without ownership, without promises it can't keep, without needing you to forget what you've lived through. You might notice it when you feel content, without explanation. When something feels right but not overwhelming. When you enjoy a moment and don't feel the urge to trap it. That's not absence. That's maturity. And I know part of you might resist this idea, because reframing happiness can feel like settling, like accepting less. But it isn't less. It's lighter. It doesn't press on old wounds. It doesn't test your resilience. It doesn't ask you to risk the parts of you that already paid their price. It respects your boundaries. It understands your pauses. It knows that you don't need intensity to feel alive. This kind of happiness doesn't arrive to prove anything. It arrives to accompany you. And maybe that's why it doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't rush in or out. It doesn't demand your belief. It simply stays where it's allowed. I'm not asking you to redefine happiness today. I'm not asking you to embrace it, chase it, or trust it more than you already do. I'm only inviting you to notice that what you thought was disappearance might actually be transformation. That what you assumed had left might have just learned how to be quieter around you. You didn't become distant from happiness. You became someone it had to meet at eye level. And that kind of meeting doesn't happen loudly. It happens slowly, with respect, with space. I'm staying right here with you as that idea settles, not to rush it, not to label it, just to let it breathe naturally. So whatever comes next can feel like an extension of who you are now, rather than a return to something you've already outgrown. Let's slow this down together. Not because something is wrong, not because you need fixing, but because safety is something you're allowed to feel without earning it. You don't have to chase joy. You don't have to reach for it. You don't have to convince it to choose you. Let it sit next to you. I know that idea can feel unfamiliar. For a long time, joy may have only shown up when you worked for it, when you adjusted, when you stayed agreeable, when you stayed strong. So, your body learned that happiness required effort, that ease had a price, that rest had conditions. But there's another way for joy to exist now, one that doesn't ask you to perform or pursue. You don't need to invite it in with excitement. You don't need to greet it with optimism. You don't need to make room by pushing yourself aside. You can simply allow it to be present, without expectations. That's emotional safety. It's the feeling of not being watched, not being evaluated, not being measured by how grateful or open or positive you appear. It's the quiet understanding that nothing is required of you in this moment. You don't have to lean forward. You don't have to explain yourself. You don't have to promise anything about the future. You're allowed to be exactly where you are, and let whatever goodness exists meet you there. I think many women like you learn to associate joy with movement, with effort, with anticipation. If you didn't chase it, it slipped away. If you didn't tend to it constantly, it faded. If you relaxed, it disappeared. So rest began to feel dangerous. Stillness felt like negligence, and calm came with a subtle tension. But joy doesn't always need motion to survive. Sometimes it needs space. Sometimes it needs permission to exist without being interrogated. You don't have to test it. You don't have to see how long it will last. You don't have to prepare yourself for the moment it leaves. You can let it sit beside you without touching you at all. That kind of closeness doesn't threaten your balance. It doesn't pull you forward. It doesn't ask you to surrender control. It just keeps you company. And maybe that's what safety feels like now. Not intensity, not certainty, not passion that demands everything, but companionship that doesn't ask you to change. You don't need joy to rescue you. You don't need it to justify your past. You don't need it to promise permanence. You only need it to respect your boundaries. And if joy can't do that, you're allowed to keep your distance. There is nothing wrong with choosing steadiness over excitement. Nothing wrong with preferring peace over thrill. Nothing wrong with wanting moments that don't ask you to brace yourself. You've already proven you can survive upheaval. You've already shown resilience in ways that didn't get applause. Now, you get to choose gentleness. Letting joy sit next to you means you don't have to decide anything. You don't have to label it. You don't have to build plans around it. You can acknowledge it quietly, the way you might acknowledge someone sitting beside you on a long train, ride-aware, respectful, not obligated. That's not indifference. That's discernment. You're not withholding yourself. You're creating conditions where nothing has to be forced. And if joy stays only briefly, you don't have to chase it down the platform. You don't have to analyze why it left. You don't have to take it personally. Its presence was real, even if temporary, and its departure doesn't undo that reality. Safety isn't about guarantees. It's about knowing you'll remain intact, regardless of what happens next. You don't need joy to hold you together. You already do that. So when something warm shows up, a quiet laugh, a peaceful afternoon, a sincere exchange, you can let it sit with you, without leaning into it, without pulling away, just sharing space. That kind of sharing doesn't exhaust you. It doesn't activate old alarms. It doesn't require vigilance. It allows you to breathe normally. I'm not suggesting you lower your guard for anyone. I'm not asking you to trust more than you're ready to. I'm not offering comfort as something you must accept. I'm simply acknowledging that you deserve moments that don't require courage. Moments where you don't have to be brave. Moments where you don't have to risk anything. Moments where joy is allowed to be gentle, and you are allowed to be unchanged. You don't have to chase joy. You don't have to invite it in loudly. You can let it sit next to you, quietly, respectfully, without promises. And if it stays, it stays. If it doesn't, you remain whole. I'm here with you in that space, not to pull you forward, not to anchor you to anything, but to recognize that safety isn't something you wait for anymore. It's something you already know how to create, and we can stay right here with that understanding, letting it settle naturally, so whatever comes next doesn't feel like a demand, but like an option you're free to accept or decline, in your own time, without pressure, without urgency, without losing yourself. If happiness comes again, it won't have to prove anything. Not to you. Not to your past. Not to the part of you that learned how to survive disappointment quietly. It won't need to arrive with explanations. It won't need to make promises it can't guarantee. It won't need to justify why it stayed this time or why it didn't last before. It can simply arrive as it is. I want to be very clear about something, because this matters. You are not waiting for happiness. You are not missing it. You are not standing in the way of it. You are standing with yourself now, and that changes everything. If happiness comes again, it doesn't need to be impressive. It doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to heal old wounds to earn a place beside you. It can be small, ordinary, almost unremarkable to anyone else, because you are no longer measuring joy by how long it stays. You're measuring it by how honestly it feels while it's here, and that's a quieter, truer scale. You don't need happiness to redeem your past choices. You don't need it to confirm that your life turned out right. You don't need it to compensate for what didn't last. You already lived those chapters with integrity. So if happiness comes again, it can sit with you without pressure. It can exist without auditioning. It can share space with your caution, your wisdom, your pauses. It doesn't have to replace anything. It doesn't have to erase anything. It doesn't have to win you over. I know how exhausting it is when joy feels like a test. When you're expected to be grateful enough, open enough, hopeful enough to deserve it. That kind of happiness always asks for too much. But the happiness that belongs with you now doesn't ask for effort. It doesn't need reassurance. It doesn't demand faith. It understands that you've already given enough. If it stays for a while, it stays. If it stays briefly, it stays honestly. If it passes through quietly, that doesn't make it meaningless. Nothing real is invalidated by its ending. You don't need to capture happiness anymore. You don't need to frame it, define it, or make it part of a story you tell yourself later. You can let it be momentary. You can let it be unfinished. You can let it leave without chasing it down with questions. You don't owe happiness your vulnerability. You don't owe it your future. You don't owe it trust on credit. You can meet it where you are, as you are, without negotiating with yourself. That's not resignation. That's self-respect. There's a tenderness in you that never disappeared. It just learned to stand behind discernment instead of urgency. And if happiness notices that tenderness now, it won't try to bypass your boundaries. It won't try to rush your heart. It won't ask you to be younger, softer, or more optimistic than you feel. It will meet you as you are, calm, grounded, whole. And if it doesn't come right away, that's not absence. That's space. Space where you are not bracing. Space where you are not waiting. Space where your life is not on hold. You are not paused between joys. You are living. I'm not sitting here to promise you anything. I'm not suggesting a future that needs to unfold a certain way. I'm only acknowledging that you no longer need happiness to arrive as proof that life is kind. You already know how to be kind to yourself. So, if happiness comes again, it can come without expectations. It can come without conditions. It can come without needing to stay forever to matter. And if it comes slowly, that's fine too. If it comes sideways, if it comes disguised as peace rather than excitement, you'll recognize it, not because it dazzles you, but because it doesn't disturb you. It won't knock you off balance. It won't make you forget yourself. It won't ask you to gamble with parts of you that deserve rest. It will simply feel compatible, and that's enough. You don't need to decide anything about happiness today. You don't need to leave space for it on purpose. You don't need to prepare for it. You're already living in a way that doesn't push it away. I'm staying here with you in that understanding, not to lead you anywhere, not to hold anything open. Just acknowledging that whatever comes next doesn't have to be earned, proven, or justified. It can arrive quietly. It can stay gently. It can leave without harm. And you will still be standing, intact, present, and enough, exactly as you are, right now.